That'd be just perfect.
Okay.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to call to order this meeting of the Planning and Development Council of the Town of Oakville. We have regrets from Councillor Robinson and Councillor Chisholm. Do we have any declarations of pecuniary interest? Madam Clerk, I see none. Council, we have a consent item here, which is the assumption of Plan 20M 873 on south of Dundas, west of 3rd Line. This is a consent item. Is there a motion? Councillor Elgar? We don't need a seconder, thank you. Do you have a question? No. All those in favor? And the consent item is approved. There is no confidential consent item. Brings us to our first public hearing item. Oh, you're right. Beg your pardon. I need somebody to move that we go into committee of the whole. You'd think I'd learned that by now. Councillor Hutchins and Councillor Duddick, all those in favor. And it's just, we did that first.
Okay.
I beg your pardon. Thank you, Clerk. So this is the public hearing, public meeting report for the town-initiated zoning bylaw amendment for the short-term accommodations and bed and breakfast establishments. And it's a recommendation that the comments from the public with respect to this report be received. It's not a decision night for this matter. This is a feedback night, if you will. At a later time, council will have a return visit by staff with a recommendation report. And if we turn our attention to Brad Sunderland, I know he'd be glad to give us a précis of what council's already read so that the public can catch up with what we're doing here.
So good evening, Your Worship and members of Council. Tonight's public meeting report provides an overview of the town-initiated zoning bylaw amendment for short-term accommodations and bed and breakfast establishments. The staff report can be found on page 11 of your agenda this evening. The purpose of tonight's meeting, again, is to provide an opportunity to hear public delegations on the proposed zoning amendment, ask questions of clarification, and identify planning matters to be considered prior to a final recommendation being made. No decision is being requested to be made from Council this evening. So short-term accommodations are typically described as a rental accommodation providing for a short-term period, generally less than 1 month. Over the past decade, there has been an increase in the use of short-term accommodations with the growing popularity of web-based companies that connect people with available units. As a result, concerns about short-term accommodations in Oakville have been identified. Given this, in October of 2016, Council directed staff to prepare a report on licensing short-term accommodations such as Airbnb in Oakville. The review was led by the Municipal Enforcement Services Department and informed by a cross-departmental team. The review identified that the town's zoning bylaws needed to be updated to recognize short-term accommodations as a use and to align the proposed bylaw with the licensing bylaw for short-term accommodations. In September of 2017, the Community Services Committee received a report providing a detailed review of short-term accommodations in Oakville, including public consultation and input, a best practice review, issues identification, and key findings. The report was later received by Council, who directed staff to hold the statutory public meeting this evening. To provide an overview, the draft zoning bylaw amendments would add provisions to the town's zoning bylaws to permit and regulate short-term accommodations and modify regulations for bed and breakfast establishments. The amendments would allow for the implementation of the proposed licensing bylaw to license, regulate, and govern short-term accommodations and bed and breakfast establishments. The town has 2 zoning bylaws, Zoning Bylaw 2014-14, which pertains to the lands south of Dundas Street and north of Highway 407, and Zoning Bylaw 2009-189, which pertains to the lands north of Dundas Street and south of Highway 407. The draft zoning bylaw amendments are attached as Appendix A and B to the staff report. And on the next slides, we'll go into a bit more detail on the changes. The proposed amendments would establish a consistent approach for short-term accommodations and bed and breakfasts in the town's 2 zoning bylaws. The amendments to both zoning bylaws would add a definition of short-term accommodation to mean the provision of a dwelling unit which is used for the temporary lodging of the traveling public for a rental period not greater than 28 consecutive days. The proposed bylaws would also add regulations for short-term accommodations, including requiring that a short-term accommodation be operated by the person or persons whose principal residence is the dwelling in which the short-term accommodation is located, requiring that one additional off-street parking space be provided unless it can be accommodated within an existing visitor parking space, and requiring that a certificate of occupancy from the town be obtained in order to obtain a license for short-term accommodation, to operate a short-term accommodation. The proposed bylaws would permit short-term accommodations within a dwelling subject to obtaining a license in all zones that permit residential uses, which are listed on the screen here, the two zoning bylaws. This would include a full range of housing types, including single detached houses, multiple attached houses and apartments, as well as secondary apartments. However, short-term accommodations would not be permitted in the same dwelling as a bed and breakfast establishment, a lodging house, a private home daycare, or a daycare, and they would be required to meet the regulations of the bylaw. In regard to bed and breakfast establishments, the proposed amendment for zoning bylaw 2014-14 would amend the definition of bed and breakfast establishment and lodging unit to insert the underlined words noted on this slide. This is to add consistency with other regulations. The amendments would also change the regulations for bed and breakfast establishments in both zoning bylaws to permit 3 lodging units within a bed and breakfast establishment, which is an increase from the current permission of 2 lodging units, and permit a total residential floor area of 30% to be occupied by lodging units within a dwelling for the purpose of the bed and breakfast, which is an increase from the current permission of 25%. So with that, the draft zoning bylaw amendments would add those provisions to the town zoning bylaws to permit and regulate short-term accommodations and modify regulations for bed and breakfasts. The amendments would allow for the implementation of the proposed licensing bylaw to license, regulate, and govern short-term accommodations and bed and breakfast establishments. As such, staff recommend that comments from the public with respect to the town-initiated zoning bylaw amendments be received. Thank you.
Thank you. And if staff have received the same letter that council had on their desks tonight from Airbnb?
Correct, yes.
Thank you. Council, any questions for Brad? Councillor Knoll?
Just a quick clarification on the requirement for one additional off-street parking space. Is that in addition to the zoning requirements that would be in place or in the needs of the actual home itself?
Through you, your worship, it would be in addition to what is already required for the dwelling unit. So
based on the zoning for that particular area?
Correct,
Great,
yes.
thank you.
Yep.
Anyone else? Councillor Hutchins?
Thank you very much. On page 14, it prohibits short-term accommodations with the same dwelling as bed and breakfast establishment or lodging house and private home daycare and daycare. That I get. But on page 19, again, it says the plan discourages the conversion of existing rental accommodations to condominium or other forms of ownership. Why are we discouraging that as well?
So I don't have the same package as you, the actual agenda, so I'm just... So through your worship, the part where it speaks to the discouraging of converting existing rental accommodations. So those are existing rental accommodations that provide for long-term accommodations. And those are reflecting the policies that exist in our current official plan today. So within Halton Region, essentially for anything with regard to 3% vacancy rates for rental units is where it's coming from. So at Halton Region, they identify the vacancy rates for rentals, and anything below 3%, essentially we are to try to avoid at all costs the conversion of those rental units to a condominium. So that's just talking about the rental stock and maintaining that rental stock for rental purposes. So with regard to, and that's just quoting the housing policies that are in our livable Oakville plan today. So the other part that you mentioned with regard to the not allowing those same uses in a dwelling unit as a short-term accommodation, those are other uses that are permitted in single detached dwellings currently in our zoning bylaw.
Okay, so what you're saying is because our rental stock is so low, we are trying to not make it lower. What happens if the economic situation changes and suddenly we find we've got lots of rental stock? You know, does that mean that we will allow it?
So through you, Your Worship, the region of Halton tracks the vacancy rates for Halton region as a whole, and they have policies in the regional official plan with regard to housing that specify the 3% threshold to allow or not allow the conversion of rental for demolition or converting to condo. So right now we're in a position where we are below the 3%, and so we would not permit the conversion of existing rental properties.
So it's just the 3% threshold that below that we discourage it. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Giddings?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Further to your comment about short-term accommodation being operated by the person whose principal residence it is, do they have to be there or live there while they're renting out a room, or it just has to be operated by the owners of the property?
Through you, Your Worship, the intent with the principal residence component of the zoning bylaw, it does pair with the licensing bylaw, which has the definition of principal residence. And it is expected that the owner is the one that can run or operate the short-term accommodation. So they don't have to physically be there, so they can rent out their whole home and offer their whole home up for a short-term accommodation, but it does have to be operated and the license has to be held by the owner of the property or the principal resident of the property.
Thank you. And in the report, it talks about 201 short-term accommodations in Oakville, and that number has doubled in the year between 2016 and 2017. Massive growth. Do you have any sense of whether that's continuing or whether there's a forecast? At what point does that slow down or not enough people are renting to? Do you have any sense on that at all? Just the numbers staggered me.
Through you, Your Worship, those numbers were provided from a third-party company, I believe it was called iCompass, was the company. And they are experts at tracking short-term accommodations in various municipalities, and they provided those numbers to us. But with the popularity of short-term rentals and short-term accommodations, it could increase, but by how much and how quickly, I'm not aware.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Lischina?
Thank you, Your Worship. Brad, can you comment on the short-term accommodation definition again? So not greater than 28 consecutive days. So you can have a day in between and then start another 28 and then a day in between start another 28. So is there a maximum number of days in the year or that does not apply?
Through you, Your Worship, the way it's currently worded is that it could essentially do that. It's 28 days consecutively, and if it was then the owners of the dwelling move back for a couple days and then put it back up for a 28-day rental period, they could do that. One of the discussions that we did have as the staff group was there an option to have a maximum number of days per year to limit it for those impacts that could occur. And some of the conversation that I can recall is that it's very difficult to enforce the number from a licensing perspective and an enforcement perspective, enforce the maximum number of days over a year. It would require a lot of tracking and that sort of thing. So we didn't currently include it.
I can see that being a positive for the owner of the home, but the neighbors surrounding it could be very disruptive. That's the point.
Anyone? Oh, Councillor Adam.
On that issue of enforceability, is the 28-day period a practical number to enforce? Is it possible to enforce that kind of time frame?
Through you, Your Worship, I might turn that over to Jim Berry, the Director of Municipal Enforcement, for that.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. The 28-day is more enforceable, generally because there's some sort of an agreement up front from one party to the owner for a period of time. So that's something we can ask for agreements, and we can verify or check that on an ongoing basis. The overall yearly amount, if somebody's going to not abide by numbers, it's hard for us to go into an investigation and check 180 days. That would mean we'd have to monitor that for just about 360 days a year to determine if they've actually gone over that, which becomes onerous and actually unenforceable. So the shorter term amounts, we do have more ability to enforce that either through agreement or through monitoring, but the longer term it does become problematic.
So if somebody was trying to circumvent it and in effect rent continuously for some period of time, what would stop them from doing a 28-day agreement and pretending that they were away for a day and just keeping the tenant in and out?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. Again, whenever you're dealing with numbers and use of a property like this, whether it's over the more difficult is over a longer period of time. So we can expend resources to try and monitor over a shorter period of time. And there's always the opportunity for somebody to try and not comply. So in that case, we would have to expend the resources. Now, we anticipate that, in all likelihood, we will have, sorry, as I stumble through this, in all likelihood, the shorter period of time is a more enforceable number, though. We just didn't want to go into the longer period.
Councillor Luciana.
Sorry, it seems like a tag team with Councillor Adams here. So
Keep going.
to follow up then, so is this going to be, with respect to enforcement, periodic spot checks, or is it based on neighbors calling in and saying, look, this person has been here for the last 2 months? Can you check on that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it'll be a bit of both. In most of our licensing categories, although we do enforce proactively, we rely on people calling in and letting us know there's something to look, there's a concern they'd like us to look into. So we would be relying on that for the most part, but as with all our other categories of license, we would also look at it on a proactive basis doing risk assessments.
Councillor Giddings.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You talk about expectations in terms of abiding by the numbers. We'd also expect them or hope that they would get the certificate of occupancy. At previous meetings, you've detailed the challenges we have in terms of getting enforcement into the door. So how would this be any different than what we're currently facing in terms of occupancy permits or safety or fire code or anything along those lines? Because we do get calls, I think most of us up here get calls from residents expressing a concern over noise, over parking, over garbage being left out all week. Whatever, we've had these discussions. I just don't get the feeling that we have enough the possibility of enforcement.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. And that's the, a bylaw like this tries to walk that line, to provide enough enforcement or enough tools in the bylaw to allow us to effectively enforce while allowing the business type to operate as effectively as it can. So what we've done, again, in the licensing bylaw that you'll see coming forward later is, and that you've seen a version of already, we've included some elements that allow us to actually enforce that as we go forward. So there's a demerit point system in the bylaw where we can identify licensed property that have violations. If the violation is proved, we can then assess demerit points to the property, and after so many demerit points, the license can be suspended or revoked depending on the number. With the other requirements, we require the fire inspection, if it's a certificate of zoning. For any of our licensing categories, we require that up front for a license. So if somebody wants to get a license, they need to provide us that. So we have that before they actually operate as a business. If they don't provide it, they don't get their license. Obviously, if we've been contacted by them, we know that they're interested in doing that business, and we can then use that as part of our assessment for risk-based enforcement and monitor that property. So it allows us kind of a twofold opportunity. Once they're licensed, we have tools that allow us to knock on doors and speak. We know who we're speaking to. We can then check what they've provided against the reality of the property. And if they don't come in, we can determine if they have a license, and if they've contacted us, use that for risk-based enforcement.
All righty then. Are there any members of the public with information for council on this file? Council, who wants to move receipt of the information? Councillor Lischina, all in favor? And the information is received. Now, the next matter before us is the discussion item, and that's a recommendation report for a draft plan of condominium for Red Ginger Developments on Sabina Drive. And council, having reviewed this file, now turns to Jeff, I guess. Mr. Abna, we are all ears so that you can summarize this for the benefit of the public.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. A draft plan of condominium application was submitted by Red Ginger Developments Incorporated to create a standard residential condominium. The report can be found on page 31 of tonight's agenda. The subject property is located within the Green Ginger Phase 1 plan of subdivision, located at 150, 168, and 210 Sabina Drive. Just for a frame of reference, that's directly north of the Superstore on Dundas Street. So the Superstore is just south, just off of this image. As a little background, the draft plan of subdivision itself was approved by council back in December of 2013. The subdivision was registered in August of 2015, and this specific site was granted final site plan approval in March of 2016. Building permits have been issued, and the development is currently under construction. The applicant proposes a standard condominium consisting of a total of 221 apartment dwelling units in 3 separate buildings with associated common elements. The common element portion of the plan essentially includes everything except the residential units, the resident parking spaces, and storage lockers. Everything else is part of the common element. Visitor parking is provided in a combination of the underground parking garage under the 2 buildings along, or under the 1 building along Dundas, and primarily in the surface lot between the 2 buildings along Dundas. Draft plan approval and registration of the condominium plan is the last step in the planning process. It will allow for the formal transfer of the individual units to the purchasers. The subject lands are designated as Trafalgar Urban Core in the North Oakville East Secondary Plan, and the development conforms to the North Oakville East Secondary Plan. The subject lands are zoned as Trafalgar Urban Core Special Provision 19, or TUC Special Provision 19, in the North Oakville zoning bylaw. The development complies with the North Oakville zoning bylaw, and a standard condition of approval for all developments. The applicant is required to confirm that the as-built development complies with the zoning bylaw prior to registration of the plan. Staff are satisfied that the application conforms to the overall policy direction of the North Oakville East Secondary Plan and all other relevant policy documents. Staff recommend approval of the application for the following reasons. It conforms with the secondary plan, complies with zoning. It has been granted final site plan approval where the site servicing, grading, stormwater management, landscaping, urban design, and financial obligations were addressed through the conditions of site plan approval. Building permits have been issued in accordance with the approved site plan, and as such, there is no need for a condominium agreement as all financial, design, and technical requirements have been addressed through the site plan approval process, and the town holds sufficient securities to allow for the completion of the required site works. In conclusion, staff put forward the above recommendation for council's consideration, and this concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are the Ward 5 councillors full of questions about this? Councillor Knoll?
I have about 10 questions. It'll take about an hour to go through. No, I'm just kidding. I'll move the approval.
Are there members of the public with information for council on this matter? Council, it's duly moved. Councillor Relger.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to know going forward, do we think we have the right ratio of parking spaces for units? Like this one, you know, I realize where we are. We have 221 units and we have 242 parking spaces. So there's only 21 out of the 221 residents could have 2 vehicles. Do we see that as a planning staff as being a problem going forward with other projects?
Well, through you, Mr. Mayor, I know this is an issue that is being addressed separately, say from this application, because as you point out, this one was approved prior to that discussion. I am not aware of all the details of that, and maybe there's another staff member that may be able to fill you in a little more detail, but it is certainly a discussion that we've had on other applications and moving forward about whether there is the appropriate parking ratio for visitors in, and for residents in North Oakville.
I'm not really talking about the visitors, it's even the residents. And
Sure.
as we've got issues in our own ward where similar people move and all of a sudden they don't have anywhere to park their vehicles because both people have to work to afford the mortgage to live in Oakville. So, yeah, it's not just specific to this application. I just think going forward, if we are looking at that, I thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Auger. May I call the vote? All those in favor? And that is approved. Number 4 is the notice of intention to designate 191 Burnhamthorpe Road East. And Council, you have a detailed report full of interesting complications. Maybe Ms. Shepherd can simplify it all for us, and we'll hear from the public as well.
Thank you, Your Worship and members of Council. We're here this evening to address a notice of intention to demolish that's being submitted for the property at 191 Burnhamthorpe Road East, which has resulted in a staff recommendation, also a recommendation from the Heritage Oakville Advisory Committee to issue a notice of intention to designate for the property. So I'll take you through how we've arrived at that recommendation for you this evening. The property at 191 Burnhamthorpe is located just east of Trafalgar Road on the north side of Burnhamthorpe Road East. It's listed on the Heritage Register as a property of potential cultural heritage value, not designated. And as we have received a notice of intention to demolish, Council has 60 days to deal with that demolition application. The property contains a collection of built heritage resources that were identified as having potential cultural heritage value both on the Heritage Register and through the Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy Implementation Phase 1 Inventory Summary Report, although it did receive a low priority rating, and I'm going to further discuss that in just a few minutes. More investigation into the property has revealed that the property is not a significant cultural heritage landscape, but in staff's opinion and in the opinion of the Heritage Oakville Advisory Committee, the property does have cultural heritage value and an individual heritage attribute on the property. And so, as I mentioned, there are a number of structures on the property. Just to take you briefly through them, there is we've got a lovely aerial view map here, and I'm just going to take you through a couple of photos that give you more close-ups of the site. So, the 1952 farmhouse, which replaced a historic farmhouse. Actually, a historic farmhouse previously existed on the property and was demolished I believe sometime before 2009. I don't have a date for that. This was the farmhouse constructed in 1952. There are a number of modern agricultural buildings located just behind the residence that are used for various purposes, agricultural and non-agricultural today. There's a grouping of large silos as well as a grain truck platform that I believe was used to weigh grain. The feature that is of interest tonight to us is the connected barn that's located on the property, which is, again, located to the rear of the residence. As you can see here, it's a rather large structure and was constructed in several different periods. We did have the ability to visit the interior of the property as well, and I hope that Councillor Duddick, who was on that site visit, would agree with me today in saying that the barn certainly, while an imposing structure from the outside, is actually quite a bit more interesting from the inside, as it does have a number of interesting features that are relatively rare and unique, including, as you can see here in the photos that show those two large wheel structures, an interior wagon lift that was used to raise wagons from the ground level up to the loft level. Also on the interior of the structure, there is a grain silo, and you can see the heavy timbering that's used throughout the barn in the other photos, as well as the stairs that pull out into the lower level of the barn, which house livestock. So I'm going to take you through the results of the staff review and then address some of the points that have been raised by the consultants for the property. In staff's review of the property, it was our determination that the connected barn has cultural heritage value in its design and physical value as a rare and representative example of a historic timber frame barn in Oakville. This is because barns are a diminishing resource. And also, we feel that it does demonstrate a high degree of craftsmanship for its period and for its type in its rare and unique features. As I mentioned, it's a timber frame barn, which has evolved to include 20th century elements, but exhibits a number of features, including the mortise and tenon joinery, the use of wooden dowels, and the more rarer attributes, including the wagon lift and the octagonal wooden grain silo. From a historical perspective, the barn has cultural heritage value in its historic and associative values with the theme and activity of agricultural development of Trafalgar Township and its direct associations with the earlier settlers of Trafalgar Township, including the McDuffie and Bigger families, who collectively owned and farmed the subject lands for almost 180 years. We feel that the connected barn has the ability to yield information about timber frame construction techniques and the uses of early agricultural buildings. And as I've noted, historic records indicate that the construction on the connected barn could have begun as early as 1845 and was undertaken in several stages. In regards to contextual value, we feel that the property maintains and supports the remaining historic agrarian character of the area, and it is physically, functionally, visually, and historically linked to its surroundings. And so the evaluation I've just taken you through is the Ontario Regulation 906 evaluation, which defines what cultural heritage value is through its design physical value, its historic associative value, or its contextual value. A property only has to meet one of those categories in order to be considered significant enough to consider the property for designation under Part 4, Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act. And so in comparison with the consultants' reports, because I do recognize that there are some differing opinions presented to you here today, although I would note that heritage planning staff certainly were pleased with the information that was contained in the Heritage Impact Assessment that was attached to the report completed by Golder Associates. It's just that having more experience with the local Oakville context, heritage planning staff have arrived at some different conclusions than the consultants for the developer for the property. And so in the letter that was distributed today, there were 3 reports referenced, and I feel it's important to just touch on each of those, especially because one actually wasn't attached to your report. It required me to actually do a little bit of digging to find out what is the area report about. And so the area report was a report that was actually created for an adjacent development as a scaled down version of the town's heritage impact assessment. And as you may know, when we do look at developments across Oakville, if there are heritage resources that may not on the property itself, but adjacent to a property up for development, we do request that the developers look at the impact on those potential heritage resources. So the area report, as I said, was a scaled down version of what we would normally require for a heritage impact assessment. And it suggested that the barn was reconstructed in the early 20th century using both 19th century and contemporary materials, such as the concrete masonry units, the foundations. Heritage planning staff don't disagree with this. The transition of late 19th century agriculture to mixed farming certainly would have likely resulted in the lifting of an existing barn in order to incorporate the new foundation, which was to accommodate livestock stalls. The Golder report, which is attached to the appendix as an appendix to your report this evening, states that the heritage integrity analysis of the property rating is good, and so they do recognize that the barn specifically is relatively intact. It states that the design was common in the late 19th and early 20th century in Ontario. However, the report is lacking a review in the Oakville context. I think everybody here this evening, and for staff and for members of council, is certainly aware of the immense development pressures and targets that are coming up for our North Oakville lands. And while there are a number of listed heritage properties in North Oakville, some of them may have agricultural buildings such as barns remaining on them, and some of them won't. Some of them may also be meet the requirements of Ontario Regulation 906, but some of them won't. Right now, what I can say to you is that the town of Oakville has not had very many worthy examples of connected barns to preserve, and as such, the example here before you today is felt to be a good enough example to be considered significant and to warrant heritage designation. The Golder report does not include any mention of the interior wagon lift that I've shown you this evening, and it dates the barn as pre-1938. The other report that's mentioned in the submission from the property owner this evening is the Laurie Smith report. And I did want to take some time to explain this. The Laurie Smith report refers to the Phase 1 inventory of the Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy implementation that was undertaken by the town, where we looked at 63 different properties across the town of Oakville. In regards to this particular property, because there were summary reports created for each one of those properties, there was no access granted to Laurie Smith or her team for this property, and so she did not have access to visit the barn up close or see the interior. And it was considered, and while she did consider it a low priority as a cultural heritage landscape, her evaluation was not done in regards to identifying individual heritage attributes on the property. Her report did state that there was potential heritage value as a representative of a 19th century farmstead and because of its historical association with 19th century farming in Oakville. And the reasons that I've gone over with you this evening in the staff review certainly expand on that statement. In regards to the future of the site, as I've mentioned, barns and agricultural buildings, which were once common in the Oakville landscape, have been disappearing as farmland is developed, and they are becoming, in my opinion, a rare historic resource. The proposed designation of the barn, though, is not intended to prevent development of the site. Heritage planning staff have reached out to the property owner to indicate that they are willing to work with them regarding different conservation strategies for the barn, including incorporating it into a new development. So, with that said, the conclusion reached by staff and endorsed by the Heritage Oakville Advisory Committee is that the property at 191 Burnham Thorpe Road East does have significant cultural heritage value for the design physical value of the connected barn, for its historic associative value relating to the McDuffie and Bigger families, and for its historic associations with the agricultural development of Trafalgar Township, and for its contextual value as a remnant of the historic agrarian character of the area. And our recommendation before you this evening is that a notice of intention to designate under Part 4, Section 29 of the Heritage Act for the connected barn on the property at 191 Burnham Thorpe Road East be issued. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Let's see if you have any. Perhaps not. Are there members of the public with information for council on this matter? Perhaps not. Council, are you ready to make a decision? Councillor Dudek.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you very much for your report, as usual, extremely thorough and comprehensive. I would be pleased to move this, having had the benefit, as Susan had indicated, to do a site visit, and I've actually had the opportunity to visit several other barns in the Oakville community, and I've never seen something in such exceptional shape as this one. And as you pointed out, some of the features, the wheel along with that silo and that, were very, very unique. And so I have no problem moving the intention to designate this. And I would remind members of council, and I'm glad that you raised it, Susan, our designation of the property is not to prevent something from taking place, it's to preserve. And it's not our job to come up with a use for that particular building. Ours is just to solely look at the heritage merits of preserving. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dudek. Discussion? Councillor Knoll.
I don't have any questions. I just want to make a comment. I want to thank the staff and the committee for very thoughtful consideration on this matter. With the disappearing number of historical structures in North Oakville, this one is, and I've been in it years ago, that wagon device looked more like a torture device to me, but anyway, it was certainly interesting. Yeah, it was certainly interesting, and it certainly warrants preservation in some form, whether it's moved or however it's going to be treated. So I just want to say thank you very much for the consideration for one of our disappearing heritage structures in North Oakville.
Thank you. That means a lot coming from you as kind of the dean of Trafalgar Township Heritage. So thank you for that comment. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? And that is carried. Council, I invite your attention to number 5, the OMB appeal registered on or recommended to be confirmed on 1198 Cynthia Lane. And if you, I think we can get a, here we go. Nope. Oh, no presentation is required. Very well. Are there members of the public with information for council on this matter? Well then, council, it's time to make a decision. I'm going to turn to Ward 3 and see if there's oh look, there's a motion from Councillor Giddings. Councillor Giddings, what will it be?
If my council colleagues don't have any questions, I'd be happy to move the staff recommendation. On page 154, there's a typo. It talks about the house being on the north side. Of course, it's on the south side, so there's just that one correction. And I'd just like to, here's an example where the Committee of Adjustment approved the 3 variances in terms of floor area from 41 to 48.1, maximum lot coverage 35 to 36.1, and maximum height from 9 meters to 9.6. And so I ask for everyone's support in terms of appealing this one.
Thank you. Any others? All in favor? And that's carried. Now, Council, if you turn to your addendum, you will see there your Bill 139 update. And Nadia Chandra is here, and I know that she labored long and hard on this last week because I was pestering her with questions about this matter too, for the Bill 139 matter that we're bringing to Regional Council on Wednesday morning. Ms. Chandra?
Good evening, Mayor Burton, members of council. On December 12th, Bill 139 received royal assent and was enacted as the Building Better Communities and Conserving Watersheds Act 2017. The Act will result in significant changes to Ontario's land use planning system. The purpose of the report tonight is to provide council with an overview of the bill as enacted, as well as to provide you with comments on 3 proposed regulations and various initiatives that planning staff are looking at to ensure smooth implementation of Bill 139. The bill, you'll recall, was introduced by the province back in May of 2017. There was an extensive public consultation initiated by the province in 2016 to review the scope and effectiveness of the Ontario Municipal Board. The town participated in the consultation and provided a submission. Additionally, Mayor Burton provided submissions to the Standing Committee back in October in support of the changes set out in the bill. The province has provided a summary of 3 proposed regulations, and they're seeking comments by January 21st. Oh, this is the wrong presentation. I've just realized. Sorry, or I apologize, the slides don't sync up with the presentation.
That's okay, we'll wing it. So Bill 139 would continue the OMB under the name Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, but with a new standard of review. For many land use planning appeals, Bill 139 would effectively eliminate de novo hearings, and that is a hearing where the tribunal proceeds afresh as if the matter had not been previously decided. The tribunal would have a new standard of review restricted to consistency with provincial policy statements, conformity with provincial plans, and conformity with applicable official plans. The tribunal could not change council's decision on an appeal in the first instance. It would have to return the matter to council for a second decision. The tribunal would be directed to streamline hearings through things such as mandatory case management, conferences, and strict hearing timelines to be set out in regulations. Local planning appeal support centers would be established to provide the public with free advice on the appeal process. No changes are proposed that directly impact minor variance appeals, with the exception of the proposed potential timelines, 6 months, on the tribunal to processing such applications. No changes are proposed regarding site plan approvals, consents, holding bylaws, part lot, and extensions of interim control bylaws. However, a local appeal body has expanded authority to deal with appeals and motions for directions related to site plan control and motions for directions related to consents. Bill 139 also amends the Conservation Authorities Act. The amendments are intended to strengthen and clarify the framework of government's funding, programs and services, and roles and responsibilities for conservation authorities and the provincial and municipal partners. Council decisions or failure to make a decision regarding applications for official plan or zoning bylaw amendments can only be appealed on the basis that, 1, what is currently in the official plan or zoning bylaw is inconsistent with the provincial policy statement, does not conform or conflict with the provincial plan, such as the growth plan, or does not conform with the region of Halton's official plan. And 2, the proposed amendment is consistent with the provincial policy statement, in conformity with and does not conflict with the provincial plan, and conforms with the region of Halton's official plan. The new standard of review may assist in the implementation of an improved official plan or zoning bylaw by allowing them to operate with greater stability, by putting the onus on the applicant to show how the new standard of review is not currently met in the existing official plan and or zoning bylaw, and how their proposed amendments will rectify the failure. Me too. Okay. Timelines are proposed to be extended by 30 days for council to make a decision on an official plan amendment or zoning bylaw amendment, which affords greater opportunity for informed planning decisions. These extended timelines will apply to complete applications received after December 12, 2017, if the regulations are enacted as currently proposed.
The bill proposes that where an appeal is allowed by the tribunal on the basis of the conformity consistency test, the tribunal would be required to return the matter to council with written reasons. Council would then have 90 days to reconsider the matter. If that second decision is appealed, the tribunal could make another decision, but again, in accordance with the test for consistency or conformity with provincial plans and policy and applicable OPs. The new processes under Bill 139 would continue to focus on complete applications, public input, professional planning advice, and analysis of relevant provincial interests. However, there are a number of proposed changes to procedures applicable to proceedings before the tribunal that would assist in streamlining the process and could result in potential cost savings for municipalities. These include mandatory case conferences to identify issues, discuss opportunities for settlement, and the potential use of mediation. Examination of witnesses at the first hearing is prohibited other than by the tribunal. Oral submissions by parties at the hearing are proposed in the draft regulation to be limited by time to 75 minutes, but the tribunal would have discretion to increase the time where, in its opinion, it is necessary for a fair and just determination of the appeal. The province has also proposed an overall timeline for proceedings before the tribunal. For instance, 10 months for appeals of a municipality's decision in respect of an official plan or zoning bylaw. No changes are proposed to Section 61 of the Planning Act, which confirms that the role of council is a legislative one, not a judicial function. Staff will continue to review and monitor to determine whether any amendments are required to the town's procedures at meetings. The substantive changes contained in the schedules to the bill will come into force upon proclamation, the timing of which is unknown, but a recent ministry press release anticipates that it will be in the spring of 2018. Proclamation could be April 1st. The province has proposed the following transition. Appeals that are already before the OMB, as of the date of royal assent being December 12th, would be subject to the existing rules and would be heard by the OMB. Appeals made after the new rules come into force, again, proclamation could be April 1st, would be subject to the new rules and heard by the tribunal. Appeals of matters between December and proclamation would be heard by the OMB if the planning matter, for example, if a complete application was received before December 12th, and would be heard by the tribunal if they were received after December 12th. Town-initiated official plan amendments and zoning bylaw amendments adopted or passed after December 12th would be subject to the new rules. In Town Council's July 2017 submission to the province on Bill 139 and in Mayor Burton's submissions to the Standing Committee in October, Council advocated for a limited transition period as a result of concern regarding an increase in appeals being filed to the OMB by parties prior to the enactment of Bill 139. To ensure a smooth transition, and to avoid unnecessary appeals causing a backlog in the OMB's already stressed caseload, staff continue to recommend that Council request that the province adopt a transition provision that would only permit appeals to be heard by the OMB if the appeals were filed prior to first reading of Bill 139, being May 30th, 2017.
So I'm not going to move the slides because they don't match anymore at all. So as we are all aware, the 2017 growth plan, the Halton Region official plan is required to identify and delineate the boundaries of major transit station areas on priority transit corridors in their official plans. Bronny Go, for example, is identified as such and will be planned for a minimum density target of 150 residents and jobs combined per hectare. Policies would also be in the region's official plan to require lower-tier municipalities to include policies that identify permitted uses and minimum densities in the area. This is a big part about Bill 139. Decisions on these policies cannot be appealed except by the minister, and requests to amend these policies can only be made with council approval. Additional MTSAs will be identified by the region and planned according to the level of transit service planned for in the area. Higher order transit, just to remember, is defined as transit that operates in whole or in part in a dedicated right-of-way, including heavy rail, light rail, and buses.
Bill 139 was primarily enacted without substantive changes from first reading. However, there were a few changes made at the standing committee process, which include new provisions that effectively allow for settlements. So that would require the tribunal to approve a revised bylaw or plan on an appeal of a zoning bylaw amendment or official plan amendment presented on consent of the parties at either the first or the second appeal, unless the revised bylaw or plan does not meet the new standard of review. Additionally, the Act was clarified to confirm that an appeal of a zoning bylaw amendment shall not be dismissed on the basis that the bylaw is deemed to conform with the official plan under subsection 24 sub 4 of the Planning Act.
Staff are reviewing application processes and procedures to align with the new proposed timelines. Additionally, report writing for content of the reports is being reviewed to ensure that there is sufficient information in the event that matters proceed solely in writing or at an oral hearing without any examination of witnesses. That ends our presentation. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, I'll just supplement two things. Last week, acting on Council's previous resolution on the matter, I filed the Town of Oakville's comments to the EBR requesting, as the staff have indicated, that the bill be effective as of the date of first reading rather than on proclamation. Second, I can guarantee you that the bill will not be proclaimed on April 1st. You may ask how I can be so certain. It's because April 1st is a Sunday, and I'm confident they won't be doing it on a Sunday. So look for April 2nd, a little bird has told me. And third, the town's submission to the EBR, I've sent to the region, and I'm seeking to bring it to the floor Wednesday morning at the region's council meeting, where I'll be looking for one of my regional colleagues to second it and get the region to endorse it and submit it to the EBR as well, since we all know the region enjoys a high status with the province. It has the province's powers delegated to it for approval of the planning matters of the local municipalities. And so if we can get the region to endorse our position, it will strengthen it for whatever good that will do. Now, questions. I'll just start over here. Councillor Duddick.
Thank you, Your Worship. And before I go to my questions, just want to thank you for your efforts in regards to this and the representation down at Queen's Park. I do think that was instrumental in moving our concerns along. When we discussed this recently at our Planning and Public Works meeting at Halton Region, the CAO made reference to the fact they're going to be hosting a training session to look at this matter. Are we pursuing anything similar to that on the town level? And if not, is there an opportunity we can maybe speak to the regional CAO so that some of our council colleagues who may not sit on the regional council have an opportunity to sit in on it as well, given the importance of the legislation?
Through you, Mayor Burton, staff did meet, both legal and planning staff, with Halton Region representatives, and we have had discussions about potentially retaining external counsel, joint retainer, to provide some training and education about the bill.
Thank you. That's great to hear. The one question I have, and it's timely given the fact we had an item in the agenda earlier on pertaining to the Committee of Adjustment. How are we going to handle, or how is there a conundrum whereby if our planning staff recommend refusal of a Committee of Adjustment variance, and yet the committee approves it, how will this, under the new rules, affect? Is that putting us in a position where our planning justification comes into discussion or scrutiny?
Through you, Mayor Burton, just to clarify, Councillor Dudek, there's no changes to the minor variance process that would be impacted by the Bill 139 changes. So it is still the test under Section 45(1) for minor variances. But staff will be reviewing the Committee of Adjustment generally and those processes as a result of any potential impacts as a result of the changes set out in the...
I'm just concerned about any changes that maybe aren't very apparent
That's
until
right.
we get into it, sort of thing. So,
Yes.
thank you.
Next, over here on this wing, any questions? Moving along over here, we have Councillor Alger.
Thank you very much for the presentation. This has been a long time coming. I'm just wondering, first, do we have a spike in the number of applications by December the 12th in the town of Oakville?
Through your worship to Councillor Elgart, I believe there was 3, Mark, is that? 3 that we received that we thought was for that lack of non-decision that came in.
Okay, so not nearly as bad as what they had in Toronto then, I guess, where there was a run on it.
No.
Local Appeals Support Center, who is running that? Is it the provincial?
Through your worship to Councillor Elgart, it's my understanding it's the province that would run it.
Okay, and they'll be paying for it. Now, with all the applications we have in right now, when do you think we will ever see the first issue go to the Local Appeals Planning, Local Planning Appeal Committee? Based on so many, how much do we have in the hopper right now that's still going to be OMB decisions?
Through you, Mayor Burton, it's difficult to predict when those matters will be heard by the tribunal because there is, as I indicated, a significant backlog of cases that are in the board's calendar for the rest of the year. However, as you see in the proposed regulations, the province has overall time limits on the proceedings under Bill 139. So, for instance, 10 months for the entirety of that decision on an appeal of an official plan amendment, for example.
Yeah, and that's what I'm thinking, but there is such a backlog right now with the OMB. I'm having trouble in my mind figuring out how they're ever going to transition this so that we can live up to the deadlines that they're stating that have to be done. It's going to be a challenge. Now, I also hear that the OMB members will actually flip over to the Local Planning Appeal Committee, I was told last week.
Yes, through you, Mayor Burton, the ONB is continued as the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, so those appointments would continue for the tribunal.
Okay, yeah, so they're just, we're not going to know, just maybe different guidelines, hopefully they will go with. And I'm awfully glad it's not going to be April the 1st, whether it's a Sunday or not, because April Fool's Day doesn't sound like a good day to me to switch over anything. So
I'm glad I could help you out with that.
Anyhow, yeah, I think the transitional rules are going to be very important, and we don't really know yet what that drop dead date might be. So, is there any chance that could get overturned?
It's speculation through you, Mayor Burton. At this point, we don't anticipate, because of the short comment period, that it will change, and they have a limited time to get this going and implemented.
Yeah, this is almost like a history-making event that we have before us here. So, I'll be glad to see this come into play, where actually the council has some say in what goes on in planning going forward. Because up until this point, I think, 70% of the decisions go with the development industry, I think, overall, if there different people have done analysis. So I sure look forward to this happening. The sooner the better. Thank you. And thank you for all the work you've done on it.
Next, over along here, Councillor Adams.
Thanks very much for the report. I just want to get an understanding of the number of transitional appeals that we're seeing. I think we've got a half dozen or so, is that correct, that the town of Oakville has received, that are early strategic appeals in order to avoid the new rules, is that right?
Through your worship to Councillor, the friendly appeals, I believe there's 6.
6, and some of them are very large ones. I know some of them are massive developments up north that have come in early, and it's very frustrating that the transition rules are the way they're being proposed. Is there a sense of how many appeals there are across the province that are like that? Because as I understand, Toronto's got vast number of them. I don't know how many are across the rest of the province. Has anybody tried to tally them up?
Through your worship to Councillor Adams, I am not aware of anyone that's done that analysis, so I'm not sure.
Okay, so it's only, our best estimates might be, the mayor might have an estimate based on some of the conversations he's had, but I know the number is quite large, and it's a frustrating issue for many municipalities. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you for the work that's been going on.
There were more than 6.
Oh, yes, there's more than 6. I know that, and the issue is how many of them across the province, and you know, I'm kind of astounded that the province hasn't been willing to make the rules retroactive a bit.
Well, vote for my resolution on Wednesday morning, and maybe we can add some pressure to them.
That's going to be an interesting vote.
Councillor Knoll.
I'm just curious, what happens to other matters that are adjudicated by the Ontario Municipal Board, such as ward appeals, ward redistribution appeals, and things like that? Who will be adjudicating on those going forward?
Through you, Mayor Burton. So all of those matters will continue to go to the tribunal.
Okay.
And the changes are set out to the tests under the Planning Act, but those matters will continue.
So all matters that the OMB would have dealt with would go over, even ones that are outside of the Planning Act?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, if that's the end of the questions, it may be time to make a decision. Councillor Elgar moves the recommendation. All those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you, everybody. And that brings us to item number 7. If I can make my, maybe I can, oh, there. I'll go with you. Electronic is not as fast as paper, it turns out. All right, the next item is the residential character study. And what we're doing there is receiving a report. We are early in this process. We're not making decisions yet. Recommendations are yet to be formulated. And we have a registered delegation, at least one, and we have a presentation from Dwight Ingalls and Carly Dodds. So this is a two-handed show, right?
Your Worship, I'm not Dwight or Carly. I just wanted to take this opportunity. You're familiar with Carly Dodds, but Dwight Ingalls is one of our urban designers that have been in the planning department for a couple of years, and it's his first time presenting to council, so I just thought I would introduce him.
Well, I hope it's a habit-forming experience and that you're not in any way deterred by it.
Thank you, Mayor Burton and members of council. The purpose of this report and presentation is to receive the residential character study. This report can be found on pages 29 to 74 of tonight's addendum agenda. I will be presenting along with Dwight, as you know, but we would also like to acknowledge that this was a collaborative project with planning, policy, and urban design, and would like to recognize our colleagues Shadi Adab and Kate Mihaljevic and the management team for their involvement. Staff undertook a residential character study to better understand what residential character means. The current livable Oakville definition of character is the collective qualities and characteristics that distinguish a particular area or neighborhood. We wanted to take a closer look at what these qualities and characteristics are. A key component of the study was public engagement and understanding what aspects residents felt were important. Based on the findings, the study provides direction for improvements to policy, urban design, and other implementing processes to better address residential character. The study is a fact-finding exercise at the town-wide scale, which sets the foundation for more detailed analysis through other studies, including the residential policy review component of the 5-year official plan review. The study area includes all the residential areas south of Dundas Street, excluding growth areas and the heritage conservation districts. The study was initiated a year ago in January 2017 and comprised 4 stages. The first stage involved background research and analysis, including a best practices review. Numerous public engagement opportunities, including walking tours, open houses, and an online survey were available in stage 2. Based on the background work, analysis, and feedback received, the draft residential character study was produced and presented to the public in November of 2017. Feedback received on this draft informed the final version of the character study, which is included as Appendix A. Through the study process, staff also presented updates to the Livable Oakville Council Subcommittee. Residential character can be subjective and mean different things to different people or in different situations, making it difficult to define. This study examined character through a planning lens in order to identify outcomes that can be influenced through planning policy, design, and other processes. The concept of residential character is based on how elements of the built and natural environment combine to create the context and feeling of an area. It is this interplay of built form, vegetation, and infrastructure elements, including the examples listed in the table, in both the public and private realm, working together within a streetscape, which creates the character that we interpret. Character is currently addressed in the Livable Oakville Plan and the Livable by Design Manual. Section 1119 of the OP outlines criteria to ensure that existing neighborhood character is maintained and protected. The design guidelines for stable residential communities illustrate how to apply the evaluation criteria to new development proposals. Staff undertook a best practices review to understand how other municipalities approach residential character and learned that there is not one prescribed approach, but that a detailed character analysis should be focused on specific geographic areas and not on large townwide scales. For example, Burlington conducted separate studies of 3 small geographic areas, which allowed for detailed analysis that then informed area-specific official plan and zoning bylaw amendments. After a lengthy consultation and review, the City of Ottawa, introduced a mature neighborhoods zoning overlay. They adopted a your street gives you your rules approach to ensure that infill development respected the character within established neighborhoods. A streetscape character analysis is required for any rezoning, site plan, consent, minor variance, or building permit, which includes a review of the 21 surrounding lots to ensure that the development reflects an average within the area. The 3 key streetscape attributes identified include front and corner side yards, parking and driveways, and the location of the main entrance to the house. This map shows the progression of residential development in Oakville since the 1800s. As you can see, significant growth has occurred since the 1950s. Staff did not undertake a street-by-street analysis townwide as part of this study. General observations about street pattern, road profile, lotting pattern, built form, vegetation, and street trees were made as part of the background work to understand what elements and qualities stood out and if any patterns could be identified. Staff also undertook a review of development activity in the residential areas over a period of 10 years, as shown in this slide. The blue dots represent residential building permits for new construction or large additions that are considered as of right, meaning they conform to the zoning and no planning-related applications are required. The green dots represent Committee of Adjustment applications for minor variances. These indicate development proposals that did not conform to the zoning bylaw. Through the variance application review process, town planning staff consider the Livable Oakville policies and design guidelines and provide comments to the committee. The red dots represent residential site plan applications. Typically, these are not required for residential development, but can be a condition of a variance and is required where lands are created through consent or within 50 meters of the lake. Through the site plan review process, urban design staff apply the design guidelines. As you can see, a significant amount of development activity has occurred in the areas highlighted with the dark red circles over the past decade. There has also been activity north of Upper Middle Road highlighted with the orange boxes. However, this is primarily greenfield-style development activity versus redevelopment activity. Sorry, there they are. Now I will pass it over to Dwight to take you through the remainder of the presentation.
So community engagement was a major component of this study since we felt the importance to engage with residents who are actually living within these areas. As Carly mentioned already, 3 different community engagement activities were conducted during the last half of 2017. They were neighborhood walking tours, 4 in total, an online survey, and 6 open houses. During the warm months of August, Carly and myself led 4 walking tours within the study area. All resident associations were invited to any and all the walking tours. The informal nature of the engagement allowed for an exchange of ideas, thoughts, and design critiques. The benefits of being in the field and walking through neighborhoods gave everyone a sense of what actually is going on at the ground level, and especially how we felt within the setting and what contributes to that setting. Some of the comments heard during the walking tours were front yard setbacks set the tone for the street, landscape adds a layer to the built form, and many times the built form becomes less prominent with the presence of vegetation. Discussion of contemporary built form versus traditional, and also sidewalks should be present for better and safer use for pedestrians along the street. Now, for the month of September, an online survey was hosted on the town's website to gather information and to gauge how residents see and value different factors in their neighborhood, such as building stock, vegetation, and road profile. As shown on this map, we had over 500 responses, and it went town-wide. The feedback from the survey is summarized on this slide that you see in front of you now. Along the right-hand side is a nice list of comments that people were allowed to put into the survey as well, such as 18% valued landscaped front yards and mature trees, 17% identified setbacks in the siting of the homes as an important factor, 11% thought the massing or built form of replacement home to be an issue, and 9% identified building heights as a concern. From the background research, the analysis, and the community feedback, we arrived at the following primary findings. Residential character is tied to the streetscape, the look and feel of a street. Variety of street patterns, road profiles, lot sizes, building types, building heights, setbacks, vegetation, and street trees across the town. Study area can be categorized broadly into 2 areas based on era and trends of evolving building stock, and we'll go to a map of that next. Building siting, massing height, soft landscaping, and mature trees are particularly important elements contributing to residential character in Oakville. And respecting residential character does not mean that no change can occur. So, in distilling the background research, the mapping, the analysis, and the feedback, 2 broad character areas emerged as shown in this conceptual map. Type A, in the orange, represents building stock primarily built before the 1980s, and where there's a high activity level in both building permits and variances. And that was shown in the previous slide that Carly presented with the red ellipses around those areas. Type B is a yellow, represents building stock mostly after the 1980s and is built to the maximum zoning as of right. So based on the findings of the study, staff have recommended a range of options to clarify and align the direction around residential character currently contained in the official plan policies and the design directions in the design guidelines for stable residential communities, and further explore opportunities for zoning modifications and other potential process changes. These 4 are under the official plan, zoning bylaw, urban design, and committee of adjustments that we could look at going forward. And that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much. We have a question for you from Councillor Hutchins, and there may be more.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased this is taking place. I want to make it, I'd like to confirm that you've got type A and type B zoned so far, but you're not stopping there, right? You're going to be looking in a bit more granular, more detailed areas. I'd like, if you could please comment on that, because I think some people mistakenly thought that this was the end of the process, and it's not. It's the start. We're just receiving it. There are no decisions, so this process is going to evolve further.
Through you, Mayor Burton. Yes, this is just the initial phase. We are providing recommendations that the area, type A areas, we take a closer look at the zoning in those areas. But at this time, we're not recommending any specific zoning bylaw changes.
Okay, I'm getting confused here. You had the areas zoned into type A and type B. Okay, and type A are the ones that are the new development. Type B, as I understand it, are the older development areas. Was the other way around?
Yes.
Other way around. Okay, good. Okay. So you've got here recommendations: official plan, zoning bylaw, urban design, committee of adjustment. Each one potentially going into more detail in the areas, so that you don't have them zoned so large. In other words, Bronte will be looked at in more detail. Ward 2 will be looked at in more detail. Neighborhoods and Ward 3 will be looked at in more detail. At the moment, there's only been one walkabout in Ward 3, and you're, as I understand it, going to be doing another walkabout on January the 18th.
Through your worship, to the councillor, yes, there will be more refinement as the way you're describing it. That's my understanding as we go forward. This was a fact-finding exercise wherein we sorted into two big piles. But as you would understand, if you look at those maps, there are still more differences and subtle changes between the neighborhoods within the type A and the type B. So we might have an A1, an A2, an A3, a B1, a B2, and a B3. This was the big sorting and the more specific nature of it. Where you get to the precision of zoning, we really need to get to that granular level you described.
Okay, so how detailed and granular are we going to get it? The in-zone in a particular neighborhood, is that going to be adjusted?
Yes. So we will, that would be my expectation. We don't have that, we're not there yet. So we did the big sorting, and now we're going to talk about things like policy, which will inform zoning. It will inform the things we do with the committee of adjustment in terms of criteria, and all that's to come. And that dialogue with the community certainly will occur with walkabouts and further public interactions.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure people are very pleased with the walkabouts and are pleased that there are going to be future ones. Thank you.
Let me just try to clear up the dual use of the word recommendation. I think it's better if we read this word on this slide as future work rather than recommendations. And certainly that's the way council understands it, because the motion before council is only to receive the information. So next, Councilor O'Meara.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you very much for the time I know you spent with us in Ward 1. We were walking around on a nice day, so I appreciate that. Couple of questions. First, how are we defining neighborhoods? I mean, how granular do we get? Is a street a neighborhood? Is a number of streets a neighborhood? How are we going to decide how big or how small we compress the word character of fill in the blank?
Well, I think that, through you, Mayor Burton, I think that's what we have to establish through the next phase. We don't have those boundaries yet, and that would be looked at through those studies on their own.
Okay, well, let me rephrase the question then. How did the other the other examples that we looked at, Ottawa, Burlington, those places, how did they define the size of what character should be looked at through, or the lens that should be? Is it a street, a garret? Like, how granular did they go in those examples?
Through your mayor, a lot of those areas were also geographically separated. So there's geographically, sometimes it's by error, sometimes it's by something that's much more physical that separates those boundaries. The beauty and also the challenge with Oakville is that you don't have a lot of those larger barriers. You do have some creeks going through. You do have some maybe physical barriers such as the QEW that sort of inform some changes in boundaries as well. But it's a larger scale of areas than other ones.
Okay, I thank you. And the reason I ask is just recently, I've had people say, no, our street is a cul-de-sac and we need to be treated this way. And I don't really care about the street beside us because we are the character of this street and everybody else around us is not. So, and then we look at it as a ward perspective. So I'm just trying to begin to have a conversation with the people in our ward about the size and scope of what will make up an area that we define as a character.
I think maybe the planning director and I can help you a little bit. I'm going to jump ahead of you foolishly and dangerously. Can you put the historic map of settlement on here? So we're clearly going to be looking for patterning. So here you have historic patterns, and if you know, every neighborhood or every different color here that you know personally from visiting, you'll recognize has a different pattern or characteristic. And as they continue the work, I think you're going to find possibly even smaller units. And with that, Mr. Planning Director will either correct me or continue.
I'm in agreement with you, Mr. Mayor. Through to the councillor. So this is where the art will kick in. This is where the walkabouts will become more important. We noticed in our walks, if you go down in your walk, you turn the corner and you're looking at two-story dwellings all of a sudden, where you were just on a street of smaller single detached dwellings that aren't fully built out with respect to the zoning bylaw. So that'll take great care and observation with the maps. This is an excellent starting point. Things built in the 50s have a 50s look, things built in the 70s have a 70s look, but then you've got a few things where they've changed through committee of adjustment applications. So this will be the tough part, I think. This is where we're going to really need to rely on the residents, councillors, of course, to say, are we seeing a transition to 1.5 stories on this block? And is it on this side of the street? Is it reflected on this side of the street? So it's very detailed work, time consuming, but it's what needs to be done to get to the level that your guys are expecting us to do.
Thank you for that. Just two final questions. Corner lots seem to be this weird sort of loophole that developments get into, and they seem to be able to do different things by changing their driveway depending on where they are. So are we looking at that? Are we going to be looking at how those impact, or those might be the sort of pillars of the area, or is there anything we're going to do to sort of address that?
Through you, Mayor Burton, that would be part of the review of the zoning once those smaller geographic areas are determined.
Thank you. And then the last question I had was, again, some of the sort of shock that residents get when they see some of these infill developments, and I'm actually shocked sometimes, is what is actually allowed as of right compared to what is there. And some of the developments that are there are maybe 20% of GFA, where now we're allowing them and then there's an increase. So are we, would we be able to look at sort of, I don't know whether there's a double threshold, there's a percentage increase and a ratio, or I guess, I know we can't have one size fit all, but I think some of the shock comes from, I can't believe that's an as-of-right build because it was only 1,000 square foot home, but now it's a 3,500, but that's an as-of-right. So were those types of, I don't know whether that's a part of the residential character study, or would that be a part of a zoning review?
Through your mayor, that would be within the zoning, the next phase going forward. We could look at that through the zoning review and seeing what changes we'd like to make with different zoning areas.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Councilor, I'll just add to your concern there. One of the main drivers of this work is the discrepancy between the built form and the as-of-right permissions. Historically, below the highway, lots were underbuilt. And so you have all across the South, not just in your area, in Kathy's area, Kathy and Ray's area, or Dave and Nick in my area here. You've had large neighborhoods of bungalows where 2 stories were permitted, and the bungalows were smaller than the footprint that was permitted. And the reaction from the neighbors as those streets get developed up to the as-of-right level has been one of the major driving forces of council's decision to ask the planning department to do this work. And one of the things that I predict, going to be challenged by is the same people who have brought that concern forward about too much development. The cure is to reduce the amount that's as of right. And when that happens, I expect people will go, well, wait a minute, I didn't mean me. So, you know, this is very serious work, and the granularity of it is going to get us somewhere, I believe, but people are going to be faced with getting real about, do they really want to nail down and tighten down or not? And it's always been the case in Oakville that when you get the final change on paper and on the desk in front of council, new people show up to go, wait a minute. So this is going to be a challenging process. This is going to be a process that's going to rely on the goodwill and the expertise that we've built up at true public consultation, where we go back again and again to make sure that we got it right. And I'm confident that at the end, everybody will be wiser and I hope happier. So, Mark Grant, Councillor Grant, I believe you're next.
Thank you, through Mr. Chair. This isn't as much a question as a thanks to the team. Along with getting several steps in for my walk that day, I saw areas of my neighborhood that I was intimately familiar with through new eyes. And I think that says a lot for the leadership in taking us through that. So I look forward to future walks, and thank you for the work you've done.
So we're all going to get some exercise. That's a good thing. Anyone else? Who would like to move receipt? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Receive it. Let's hear the delegation and then receive all of that. Madam Clerk, would you call the registered delegation? And I'll poll the audience after.
Our listed delegation is Peter DeRosa from Trafalgar Chartwell Residents Association.
Welcome, Mr. DeRosa. I'm glad this map is up. It allows me to notice that you've got conceivably at least 3, maybe 4 different epochs or eras, time periods in your Residents Association.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members of Council, I'm going to be speaking on behalf of the DCRA. Oh. Again, I'm going to be speaking on behalf of the DCRA, and I would also like to express support, like we did in a recent letter, for my other colleagues from JCRA in particular, as well as Coronation Park Residents Association, and for the sentiments they've expressed in their letters. I'm here, first of all, to support and encourage the very important work that the staff has done and is continuing to do. But I also am here tonight to express some degree of concern with respect to the report that we've received, in that it is being presented as a final report. And now maybe that is a misinterpreted characterization based on what I've heard tonight, but nonetheless, that's what our reaction to the report is tonight. I think the concern primarily is because the report does not, at this time, adequately consider the unique nature of our neighborhood, and was not part of the walkabouts in the 4 areas addressed in the report. Our community is unique because it's because of its proximity to the downtown core, and the major role it plays in defining the character of Oakville overall. It is an older area that is made up primarily of diverse, older original homes, many of which are historical and legal nonconforming in the oldest part of Oakville. An eclectic mix of homes that have been renovated over the years, coexisting together, surrounded by mature trees, vegetation, all in harmony to create the unique character of the neighborhood it has today. It contains over 29 different zoning classifications and has the lowest lot coverage provisions. Even though it is built up to 99%, the neighborhood remains at great risk of losing its unique character because of the material impact the hospital lands and Brantwood development will have on it very soon. as well as constant redevelopment of mature lots to support larger houses. As a gateway to downtown, it will most certainly impact the look and feel of Oakville overall. We are delighted that staff has made recent arrangements to walk the neighborhood on January the 18th, where we will make the case for TCRA's neighborhood to be studied as a separate fifth area in the final report. To that end, we ask Council to consider receiving this report as a draft to be finalized by staff later. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I'd be glad to take any questions.
Are there questions for Mr. DeRosa? Thank you, sir, for your information.
Thank you.
Are there other members of the public with information for council on this matter? Well, look at that. Welcome, Ms. Hazlett-Thiel.
Good evening. As you know, my name's Janet Hazlett-Thiel, and I'm here on behalf of Joshua Creek Residents Association. And thank you for some of the dialogue earlier, because it helps clarify our understanding of step one in this process. But I do feel that we have an obligation to share with you a little bit of feedback, having read and participated in all elements so far. This is probably some of the most important work that planning will do from our perspective. Laying that foundation and understanding the character will start to eliminate a lot of the friction that occurs in these areas that are inundated with permits. And while that maps up, the map that draws our attention is the one with all the dots, because they are the ones where the tsunami has started. And they are coming, and it keeps coming. And every year that goes by where we do not more clearly define character, we are going to lose the essence of the character of Oakville. And that isn't anyone's intent, and we understand that this is the beginning of a journey. And I'm known to say, but we got to hurry up. We got to do it sooner, and we've got to be more clear. Some additional feedback for you. We have a bit of a concern because it references in the report that character is defined by looking at basically the front of a home, the street area, from the street area itself. And I'm going to dig to find that exact quote, but that's concerning, because it is not just the view from the street that defines the character. It's an important part, but it is defined also by the backyard. I would encourage you, you want to go for a walk, I'll take you for a walk. Come over to Chebucto. Chebucto gets to look out at a change of a house that was built on Devon. And when you look at it from the front yard on Chebucto to what's happening on Devon, you think, okay, how could that matter? They're streets and streets apart. They aren't. They look from one to the other. The backyard impacts the view and the character because it's now starting to tower around. I also want to reference that we're not against change. We understand change is going to happen. They're not going to look the same. In fact, some of us have developed our homes within the zoning bylaw, and you can have some beautiful homes within that zoning bylaw. But the character still needs to be defined to help those that want to push the envelope beyond. The phrase underbuilt can be misinterpreted at times. We don't think our homes are underbuilt. We think they're just right. And that they, in fact, define the character. And that you can build to within that and still protect the character of the neighborhood. A couple other comments are about privacy. Privacy is not stated in this report, and yet it should be looked into. I got asked the other day to write what I like about my neighborhood in a document, and I didn't think about residential character. I just started to list out the things, and part of it is privacy for those neighborhoods. Whether you're in South Central, in Ward 2, Ward 1, Ward 3, there's a sense of privacy. It's not defined in here. So we want to encourage you to support the staff in getting more granular, to having an action plan that really moves this along. It will go a long way to protecting what is really, really special about certain parts of Oakville. And those are our comments.
Thank you. I just want to help, I hope this helps everybody's understanding. This is a council project. Council wants granularity. Council's behind this. So we thank you for your encouragement, but how can I say it? We started this. So that's number one. Number two, this council represents all of Oakville, and we take all of Oakville seriously, and we actually believe that every neighborhood is unique, and that all of these concerns are concerns of everybody in Oakville. So I hope that encourages you to understand where we're coming from and where we're trying to get to. And I hope you heard our remarks earlier about, I was actually speaking to that underbuilt issue.
Mm-hmm.
Underbuilt is a term that we use in terms of when the house is less than what the as of right is.
Mm-hmm.
And all over Oakville and in the areas where the dots haven't come yet, there are homes that are built less than they could be given the zoning that they have today and have had for generations. And that's going to, when we get to the end of this 6 or 7 step process, adjusting that, I predict, is going to be the hardest thing that we'll ever do. So every step of the way toward there, we need to keep in mind the hard work that sits at the end, because you're going to be asking people to be happy with losing or giving up some of their rights. And that, I predict, will be, there'll be lots of public participation then.
So we, respectfully, because you engaged in it, I think our neighborhood is really, and has for a long time, understood that the size of the home can be much larger. And we have written multiple times, if they build within the zoning envelope today, which is the larger home, all the more power to them. Go ahead. That's your right. What isn't and shouldn't be your right is to go beyond that envelope. And as you've helped us with this in the past, the Committee of Adjustment is trying to some degree to pull back. But the dots show you it's still overwhelming. And so I guess we're all on the same page. And this isn't just about my neighborhood. I don't represent other neighborhoods, but I do just want to encourage whoever's idea it was that if those 6 or 7 steps could happen sooner rather than later, it would be better.
We're working as fast as we can.
Okay, thank you.
So, thank you very much. Are there other members of the public with information for council on this matter? Thank you. Well, before we make a decision to basically receive the information, I want to add that there are neighborhoods where there are single-story homes and 2-story are permitted. And when those homes start turning into 2-story homes, the visible character of the neighborhood is radically transformed. And that phenomenon is one of the major drivers of this that got council interested in this. So it's not as easy as everybody build to the limit. It's that's why I say it's going to be interesting when we get to the end. Councillor Hutchins is moving receipt of the information. Anyone else with comments? All in favor? And that's carried. Council, we have the Heritage Oakville Committee minutes, and apparently all we have to do is receive them this time. Councillor Duddock moves receipt. All those, Councillor Lapworth.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wasn't sure concerning my declaration of pecuniary interest on the minutes concerning 6B and 6D, if they should be separated for me. I'm not sure.
We can do whatever you ask. I'll call 6B and 6D separately so that Councillor Lapworth can be mindful of his declaration of pecuniary interest. And Councillor, you need to specify what that is.
Yeah, one of my income tax clients is an employee at Club Link and works at the Glen Abbey Golf Course. Thank you.
All right. So let me call 6B and 6D first. All those in favor, except for Councillor Lapworth, who's not participating. Any against? Or there's none available for against. And now for the balance with everyone participating. All those in favor? and that is carried. We need a motion to rise and report to council. Councillor Lapworth, all in favor? That's carried. I rise and report the Committee of the Whole has met and made recommendations on consent item 1, public hearing item 2, discussion items 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and advisory committee minutes item 8, as noted by the clerk. Is there a mover and seconder for my report? Councillor Lischina, Councillor Elgar, all in favor? The report is adopted. I now ask for a mover and seconder for consideration and reading of the bylaws. Councillor Adams, Councillor Grant, all those in favor? And the bylaws as presented are carried. That completes our work. It's been great working with you. I look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.